So I was wondering if you could start by painting a picture of the trade in London in about 1870, 1880.
Well, the tailoring trade sort of grew in time with the development of an improved way of life for the working class at a time when they wanted to have new clothes rather than clobbered or shoddy. I don't know if you know what clobbered garments are, and shoddy, there's a difference. Clobbered was when you put pieces together from other garments. Shoddy was just rubbish cloth or stuff sort of got off the floor. And as that was improving, it opened the door for people to actually sell cheap ready-made clothes. Now in the 1870s, you would find that in the workshops of the East End, the majority of tailors were actually of Irish origin. And when the Irish started to move out to America, people were saying, who's going to work in the tailoring trade? And of course, you suddenly had this huge influx of Eastern European Jews who were escaping the poverty and the oppression in Eastern Europe. And the one thing that they could do, because you could start working in tailoring with no skills, was go into the clothing industry. So by the 1880s, or so let's say 1881, 82, you're getting a build-up of small-scale tailoring workshops in very poor conditions, with a gradation of skills, because you also had, subdivisional labour.
And could you maybe speak to the conditions that were present in these workshops, either going from the sort of high bespoke end of the West End all the way through to those present in the East End of London?
Well, if you go to the bespoke workshops, obviously it wasn't sweated labour. Some of the tailoring shops, let's say Savile Row or somewhere, might well have had a manufacturing area at the back of the shop. You then had a lower gradation of workshops just off Savile Row. And we shouldn't forget that there were a number of tailoring workshops in Soho, which we do tend to forget, but probably were in the same condition. And when you get to the East End, you get increasingly bad conditions. You get overcrowding, you get very small workshops, overheating. Sometimes the temperature in the workshop could be up to 86 degrees because you had the ovens there. You also have a habit which is not very pleasant, but they would use urine to glaze the cloth. So you really had a very unpleasant atmosphere. You had, in the East End of London, a workshop could be 10, 15 people. If you go up to Leeds, which you might want to be interested in, you had much bigger workshops. And the conditions were poor, and you had, as I say, gradations of labour. And in the majority, or nearly all cases with the workshops, the garments would be cut out. A wholesaler would actually have a cutter, because you didn't have skilled cutters in the workshops in the East End. Cutter would actually cut out, put the garments in bundles. The workshop master would collect the bundles, wheel them to his workshop and give the work out, and give it to machiners, pressers, underpressers, etc. And it was established that the wholesalers would insist that the master wasn't more than a half a mile away from their outlet, so that they could take the bundles back and forth very quickly.
Great. Could you speak maybe to the notion of subdivision and how the unskilled worker was treated as compared to the skilled or semi-skilled worker?
Well, subdivision, somebody believed that did the research that it came from Eastern Europe. It didn't. The actual tailoring trade developed far more widely in the East End, though as an aside, maybe relevant or not, a tailor in the shtetls of the Eastern Europe was considered the very lowest form. If you were very religious, you were respected. If you were a tailor, you weren't. So, if your daughter wanted to marry a highly religious person, that was great. If they wanted to marry a tailor, it wasn't so good. Now, subdivision started way back when tailors would get their wives to sew on buttons or help with buttonholes. And the realization came that this was actually quite practical. So you would get the gradations of skill, and you would go from a very basic unskilled worker, right up to the machiner who could actually determine the appearance of the garment, the presser who by his skill could actually press a garment into shape, to the underpresser who would also be responsible for lighting the ovens to heat the irons in, to the unskilled worker who would just do the basic work. And of course you did have some women working in the workshops, predominantly non-Jewish women, but some of the masters had their wives working there. And there was something called, well, there's a Yiddish word for it, was called the Chazer's market. I don't know if you've heard of that, the pig market. And that was where all those tailors who were looking for a job would actually gather in somewhere called Greatorex Street, which is just off the Mile End Road. And if you wanted a tailor, if you wanted a presser or a machiner or an underpresser, you would go along or send someone along to the Chazer market and actually select someone. And I interviewed someone some years ago whose father had been a master tailor, and he said his father had told him, if you want a good presser, you get someone with one arm longer than the other. Because in those days, the irons, and I don't know if you've seen them, the irons were solid. They were very, very heavy. And so obviously the skilled presser, his iron-using arm would be longer than the other.
Wow.
Could you maybe now sort of describe the landscape of trade unionism just before and then as new unionism sort of comes to the fore?
Well, you had skilled unions. You had the Amalgamated Society of Tailors, which called itself a skilled union. That was founded in Manchester in 1866, I think. And then you had, to which tailors would belong, and they would have branches. They had numerous branches. They would have branches all over the country. You also had Jewish trade unions. Now, there weren't any trade unions in Eastern Europe. That was something they learnt when they came over here. There was a belief that they brought them from Eastern Europe. They didn't. And there were a number of Jewish trade unions, small trade unions, which came and went and didn't endure for long because the East End Jewish tailor was not very reliable. And one of the most important aspects of a good trade union is a good trade union leader. The union secretary has got to be very good. And whereas in Leeds, you had very good union leaders, in the East End, they fluctuated because you had people who were not very good and you had very hot-tempered unionists. Another problem was actually the busy and the slack, because if you had, and you know what the busy and the slack is, and I mean, coming up to, pardon?
I don't.
Okay, the busy and the slack. Okay, the busy was usually the lead up to the season, the London season, and then you'd have everybody working like mad, and then it would slow down, that would be the slack, and then it would build up again in the autumn towards the winter. So, it was no good going on strike in the slack because they weren't particularly interested. So if you were going to go on strike, you went on strike in the busy. And there were a number of multifarious trade unions which sort of came and went and disappeared after a strike. And really, the Jewish trade unions didn't endure. The Amalgamated Society of Tailors and Tailoresses did. And if we're looking to compare with trade unionism in Leeds, where there were factories, that endured. One was founded, the Amalgamated Union of Clothing Workers or Clothing Operatives, and that survived right until a major amalgamation in 1814 or 15.
Have you any ideas about why the one in Leeds endured and the
They
ones
had,
in London?
Yes, you had a large-scale union, factory workers, led by Joseph Young, who was very efficient and kept people in check. You also had union leaders Jewish leaders in Leeds who also were socialist, but very efficient. Whereas in London, you tended to have small-time leaders, or one called Lewis Lyons, who was quite a character, but he was not very reliable, and therefore he couldn't control it, and the unions just disintegrated.
Could we sort of now move on to the role of the female tailor in this period? You touched upon initially subdivision, wives, buttons, finishing. Maybe speaking to the rise of the tailoress, the formation of her own union.
Well, women were exploited. I mean, there was a growth of new, if you like, female trade union after the match girl strike in 1888. Was it 1888. And you had a major, well, you've got certain aspects. You had a major strike of Jewish tailors in 1889, and you also had the Sweating Commission in 1888. But the role of the tailoresses, well, they used to be called kippers, because when they went round for a job, they'd go in pairs. So they would be called kippers. They were poorly paid. And again, they weren't ardent trade unionists. They weren't particularly geared to belonging to a trade union, and they might belong for a short while. And then bear in mind, you had to pay money to belong to the union, so you had to have the income, and their jobs were most insecure. So female trade unionism in the tailoring trade was not of any great significance. More so in Leeds, where you had the factory and the factory girls with slightly more reliable employment, whereas, somebody could be a master tailor with having a workshop one year, and next year he'd go back to being employed as a machiner.
Could we maybe also start speaking about the Whitechapel shtetl during the same period, and maybe touch upon the differences or the animosity, small animosity that occurred between Jewish communities, differences in education?
Jewish communities per se, or Jewish communities and non-Jewish communities?
Jewish communities per se.
And then maybe Jewish and non-Jewish.
I wouldn't say, maybe you've read more than I do. I wouldn't say that there was that much animosity between them. I think there was a significant sort of self-help attitude. I don't think there was animosity. There might have been between master tailors who had exploited their workers and the workers. There would be animosity and bad feeling, but an overall feeling of community, I think, existed. I refrain from using the word anti-Semitism until we get to a later period, but that's just me. I use the term anti-Jewishness. And of course, you've got increasing tensions as Whitechapel and the area around it is being completely overcrowded. I think it was 150,000 people, Eastern European immigrants living there by the end of the 19th century. So the tensions exist outside, and you then have the complaints about the sweating system and sweated labour, and the usual refrain, they're taking the jobs of Englishmen. And one of the aspects, actually, which I could mention, was that when they started to manufacture cheaper but ready-made garments, approaches were made to English tailors, and they wouldn't do it. So there was they turned towards the Jewish tailoring community because English tailors thought it was beneath them to actually manufacture those kind of garments.
Could we maybe speak to the company structures in the workshops of the East End, going from maybe master tailor's position and their job to that of the middleman, sort of bringing in the work?
Well, the master tailor would probably be the middleman, because he would be bringing in the work. Whether he worked or not is another story, but he was the middleman. He would go out and get the work from the wholesaler and then bring it back to the workshop and give it out. Now, within this context, you had the occasional cabbage, which I'm sure you've met as well. Cabbage? Well, cabbage was when the tailors or the master, whichever, they'd collect their bundle, and somehow, if they could possibly make up an extra suit, and it was the women, I should add, I haven't said that, but the women that usually worked on the trousers and the men worked on the jackets. But if you could make an extra garment that the wholesaler hadn't accounted for, then you could sell it privately. And that was called your cabbage.
Oh, my grandfather used to do that, apparently.
That was cabbage.
Who was the sweater then?
The sweater was the middleman, the master. The sweater was the master, not the wholesaler, although the middleman would argue that it was because the wholesaler was paying them so little that they had to sweat their workers to get any profit. But there was a huge uproar, as I say, in about 1888, which set up a royal commission on the sweating industry. And it was then looked at other trades as well, a few others, where there was considered. Sweating labour, the definition was working the longest hours for the lowest wages in the worst conditions. And the conditions, I mean, I was taken to a workshop in the East End. You can include this or not because it's relevant. I suppose it was in the early 1980s, because what happened was that gradually the Jewish tailoring fraternity was handing it over because they wanted their children to become accountants and lawyers, not tailors. And so you had at that time people from Pakistan, bearing in mind Bangladesh didn't exist till 1971, so you had Pakistani people. And I went into one of the Pakistani workshops, and it was exactly as it would have been 100 years before. It was in Hanbury Street, if you know Hanbury Street, down a stone staircase into a huge cellar, which had no natural light, and you had workers working round tables, and you had the offcuts under the table, thrown under the table, and I was told I mustn't speak, and I mustn't certainly sort of say anything about what I was doing to the workers. And that to me was exactly the same conditions. No natural light. They probably got there before it got light, they left after it got dark. And they were, the middleman was looking at them to make sure that they weren't passing on any information. So the sweating conditions were, in the East End, pretty bad.
Thinking about that transition from the Jewish tailoring days through to the more contemporary, I presume it still is, Pakistani or Bengali.
Well, what you also had earlier on, just a bit, was the Cypriot community coming into it. You would find some Cypriot tailoring workers on the border of Holloway, but there were also some taking over in the East End. And what happened where they were concerned was that they went back to Cyprus and started manufacturing in Cyprus and then exporting it to us. I mean, I don't know whether the kind of garments, you would know better than I, kind of garments that were being turned out in the sweatshops weren't exactly top style. Now, where are those being made? You would know, I don't know. Are they being made in Bangladesh and places like that and then transported back? Well, that's where your sweated labour is.
Yeah, it's been exported mostly.
Yes, it's, Cypriot started it. So I know that I took a group of students down Fournier Street with Colin Holmes. I don't know if you've come across his work. He was the original immigration expert, Colin. I think he's still alive. He wrote John Bull's Island, which is a superb account of traditions of... you're making me remember I have to get in touch with all these people. And we walked down Fournier Street. That must have been early 1990s, and we were talking about how they'd been sweatshops, and there were builders, and they said, you wouldn't get that now, mate. They're going for $1 million. And that was, if you know Fournier Street, I mean, now you're talking 6 million.
Yeah.
Whereas Fournier Street used to have multiple workshops.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, for the sake of the interview, so the sweater would or could have been Jewish.
Sweater was. Oh, yes. I did a thing about Leeds actually for the BBC, and he said, oh, they weren't Jewish. They said their philosophy was, I suffered, therefore you can suffer. And the sweater was the Jewish workshop master. It was never, all right, they condemned the wholesaler for the price they offered, but the sweater was the Jewish workshop master. And when there was a strike, it was against the workshop masters and the middlemen. The workers were protesting, always, absolutely.
Could you now touch upon the anti-alien sentiment which was prevalent within the trade itself?
The anti-alien sentiment really came from the TUC. And the concern wasn't so much with the trade, it was the numbers of pauper aliens. You never saw in the records, in the trade union minutes, it was never Jews, it was always pauper aliens. And the concern was the number of pauper aliens, and you think about contemporary attitudes towards them, was the number of pauper aliens that were coming into the country, and they were not only taking our jobs, they were marrying our women, they were they were dirty, they didn't know how to use the latrines. I mean, everything you can think about in contemporary subject, you can think about then. And it was in 1895, the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, passed a motion saying that there had to be a stop to the entry of pauper aliens. And this went on. There was an investigation into the alien question, I think it was 1901, where there was evidence given by a number of Jews saying basically, they weren't that bad. But in 1905, as a direct result of the tensions that had arisen of the numbers of Eastern European Jews living and crowded in the East End, they were absolutely jam-packed, they passed the first Immigration Act ever in 1905. And that was to control the entry of pauper aliens. And what's interesting is the Jew was known as the alien. It was never, very rarely the Jew. It was the alien, and the word anti-Semitism was introduced by a German called Wilhelm Marr in 1873 because Germany was into racial prejudice and racial superiority. And that was used explicitly, anti-Semitism, and he used it towards Jew hatred. But you don't see it in the literature in this country for quite a while. I don't remember seeing it till after the First World War, and then very rarely.
Could we now move on to the difficulties in organising a disparate workforce versus one which is concentrated, such as in Leeds?
I don't so much think it was disparate as the nature of the animal. They were very unreliable, very hot-blooded. They would belong to the union when it suited them. They paid their dues, but then, as I say, a lot of it was to do with the secretary of the union and keeping your people in check. And that was the problem, because if you look in my book, Jewish unions came and went, very few lasted. As I say, the one that did survive eventually was the United Ladies Tailors Union. And I'm sure nobody has, but somebody actually said to me, well, there was a tailoring trade union for ladies because there was the United Ladies Tailors Trade Union. And I said, no, they made clothes for ladies. They were United Ladies Tailors. So, they were just very difficult to keep under control. And if you're not working, you're not going to pay union dues, and then you'd make demands which weren't possible to actually support.
It sounds like it was a very unstable profession.
It was. I mean, that's the whole point, because in the busy you would work, in the slack you wouldn't. There were debates about whether you should be paid by piece or time. Piece very often meant that you were paid by the number of garments or trousers or jackets you produced. So the master would keep it all, sort of the last few days. So if you were on time, he'd actually keep it right till the last 2 days and then give it to you. And there were great debates about whether they should work on piece, was the number of garments you produced, or time, which was payment by the day. So that was another problem with actually organising and agreeing, and how much you got paid by the hour if you got paid by the hour.
Can we sort of explain maybe how economic conditions play a considerable impact on trade union membership numbers and broadly the success of trade union activity?
Well, absolutely and completely, because if the economy is not doing well, demand falls. Therefore, you're not ordering as many you're not ordering as many garments to be manufactured, and therefore you're not employing people. So when the economy is doing badly, and I think between 1888 and 1892 it wasn't too bad, but when the economy is doing badly, as you'll see reflected in contemporary issues, then obviously that has an impact on the trade, which has an impact on who you employ, which has an impact on the trade unions and who belongs to a union and who's at a time when there's no social benefits, when you're totally impoverished.
I'd love it if you could recount the tale of the 1889 strike and maybe speaking to the character of Lewis Lyons.
Lewis Lyons was amazing because he was a flawed character. Whereas you had Jacob Finn, I think, and John Deitch, and who went on to America and do great things. I mean, Lewis Lyons was great, but he was flawed. And he was involved in all sorts of things and accused of all sorts of things, so he really couldn't maintain and keep the unions going. Otherwise, things would have been very different. The 1889 strike, I can't remember what they were. Can you remember? Can you remind me? I did read it, but I can't remember. I get it confused with the dockers, actually. The dockers were asking for an extra penny, and the dockers... They
were asking for a 12-hour working
yes.
day, 1 hour lunch, half hour for tea. They're asking for a limit to overtime.
So do you want me to say all that?
Not necessarily,
no.
But maybe just describing the moments that led up to it.
Well, they were asking for improved conditions and they were asking for more money, and they went on strike, and it was quite a good time because the economy was doing well. So, that's the time you go on strike. You go on strike when you're needed. At the end of the day, it went on for a long time, and I think what's significant is that they got support from the dockers, who they later supported as well when they struck later in the year. And the dockers providing them with funding, and they attended the meetings, very much analogous with the Battle of Cable Street, if you like. And the strike was successful, but the success didn't last, because once the economy went into a downturn, the masters didn't keep their word. So, it was an important strike. It was a memorable strike, and I think I've got a picture of the strike banner in here, which you could show, which would tell me all the demands.
Yeah, it seems in every generation the battles need to be fought again.
Constantly, which is this. Yes, this is Tailors and Tailoresses' great strike of London tailors. Hours reduced to 12. All meals to be had off premises. Because I remember when I went into that workshop, they were eating because they weren't allowed to go off the premises. Government contractors paid union rates, and not to give work home at night after working hours. So, that was the sweating trade. Well, that prevailed until things got bad, and really the employers weren't interested. But that was memorable. The next one was 1911. There was another major strike in 1911, and there were intermittent strikes.
So when those better conditions didn't prevail, this may be a bit too granular, but did they just kind of get rid of all those better conditions all at once, or did they just was there a...
Well, they sort of gradually, they gradually, A, they got rid of a lot of the workforce because you didn't need them. And B, you didn't have to adhere to the agreement because nobody was going to go on strike when you couldn't get work. And the masters weren't prepared to give in, because what's the point when there's not enough work around? You have to strike. The problem is you have to have a good leader, and you have to strike when the economy is doing well. And you can see that in every industry at every time.
Yeah.
And Lewis Lyons was fallible, unfortunately. Interesting character, but very fallible. And
what were his weaknesses?
He was a flawed character. I don't think he was very good with, I don't want to cast aspersions. If I remember, he wasn't very good with managing the money. There was somebody up in Leeds also accused of taking union funds. He wasn't very good with managing the money. And he tried to lead strikers to go and eat a meal outside the great synagogue in front of the chief rabbi, and silly things like that. So, whereas you have the example, as I say, in Leeds, of strike leaders union leaders who were very reliable, very sensible, and the unions endured.
You mentioned in the book the downfall of ideologues, utopian ideas.
The anarchists and the socialists, well, they're all very well, but they're not practical in the real world. I mean, you had the syndicalist union, you had the anarchist union. They were very short-lived because they're not practical to keep those ideologies in the real world. Perhaps we're more ideological now, I don't know. But if you think about it, you want, as I said, you want bread today, not jam tomorrow. So, particularly in those years, and bearing in mind that a lot of your Jewish workforce were illiterate. That is a major point. A couple of the strike leaders way back, end of 1870s, 1880s, offered English classes to the workers and they didn't want to know.
Do they think it was a waste of time?
Yeah, I mean, but they came out, if you think about it, and there was somebody, a historian, who said that the trade union and the method of subdivisional work was the result of Jews reading the Talmud. But when you look into it, they couldn't read. A lot of them could not read. My late grandmother came over at the end of the 19th century. She couldn't read or write. And that applied to a lot of the men as well. Although they were offered classes, they didn't want to go.
What did the 1909 Trade Boards Act do for sweating? We mentioned.
Well, it was a landmark because it was an attempt to set wages and set conditions. Not all the trades went into it. And there was another one in 1918 which brought in, I'm not sure if the mantle makers went into the 1909, but that was a period of great improvement generally because, you had old age pensions, you had sick benefit. It was that period under, I think, the Liberal government when you began to see a realisation that the working man had to be treated with respect and care. So the Trade Boards Act was a very important element in the forward move of labour and the forward move of, if you like, the tailoring workforce in being, respected.
Could you describe the recipe for success needed for trade union activity?
Well, you need a sound economy. You need leadership which is conscious of what is needed, compassionate with its workforce, a good working relationship, if possible, with the employer, and realistic demands when it came to strikes or demands from the employers, and to understand your workforce. And I think that made an honourable individual and an educator. One of the successful leaders in Leeds had been an engineer and a very highly educated man who ended up as a trade union leader. And, that's the kind of person you need. I mean, Lewis Lyons was okay, but he didn't have the skills that enabled the unions to... And it took until 1939 till the United Ladies Tailors, because you have these amalgamations that take place in 1915, early 20s, and then 1939, when you have the trade unions coming together in the clothing industry as one powerful body and bringing together, as you said to me, men, women, and all the skills, because that's another element. If you look at your East End trade unions, they're only sweated workers. You look at the larger unions, they bring together all the skills and both genders and, where possible, different ethnic groups. And if you get that and a sensible leader, then you can work on it. And I remember being in the NUTGW offices, I was doing research, when they were just about to go in with the GMB. And I got them, I think, quite a lot of the stuff from the NUTGW went to Queen Mary.
Right.
Because I got them. Some of it went up to Manchester and some of it went to Queen Mary.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes, so because I said to them, what are you going to do with it? I mean, I remember digging on the shelves because they were lovely. I used to go up there, take my lunch, have a chat with people that worked there. Well, I can't remember, it's a long time ago. I found the handbook of one of the Jewish unions sort of fallen down the back of a shelf behind a pile of books. I mean, this wonderful goodie, you know, I sort of sat there and so there's a little bit of luck in research.
Yeah.
Yes. Should we have a break?
Yeah.